Just hours before my wedding, I received a voicemail. It was from my father telling me I was wasting my life playing computer games while his real empire crumbled. Listening to it, I didn't feel anger. I felt this cold, heavy clarity settle over me, the kind that comes when you finally accept someone will never see you for who you are. And it made me wonder what happens when the game is the only thing that can save him. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe because you are not going to want to miss how this story ends. The air in the command center was chilled, smelling faintly of ozone and industrial-grade coffee. I stood before the main screen, a wall of glowing maps crisscrossed with lines of data that pulsed like arteries. This was my world, U.S. Cyber Command, a place where wars were fought not with bullets, but with billions of lines of code. As Admiral Norah Vance, I was the architect of this silent battlefield. My team, a collection of the sharpest minds in the nation, moved with quiet efficiency around me. They were extensions of my own will, translating my strategies into digital defenses that protected everything from the power grid to the stock market. A quiet nod from me could shift global assets. A single command could neutralize a threat a continent away. Here I was seen. I was understood. Then a small vibration against my hip. My personal phone. An unwelcome intrusion of color in a world of monochrome encryption. I glanced down. A missed call and a voicemail icon. The number wasn't saved, but I didn't need it to be. I knew the specific cadence of my father's digits like a password I could never change. I slipped into a soundproofed alcove, the hum of the servers fading behind reinforced glass. I pressed play. Richard Vance's voice filled my ear, strained and laced with the familiar edge of disappointment. "Nora," he began no greeting. "Your mother would be spinning in her grave. The whole company is grinding to a halt. $50 million of real assets, Nora. Real trucks on real roads, and it's all frozen. Some computer problem." He said the word computer like it was a cockroach he'd found in his soup. "I'm out here fighting a real war to save this family's legacy, and you're off somewhere playing your games." He sighed, a sound heavy with theatrical despair. "I just thought you should know what happens in the real world." The message ended. I stood there for a long moment, watching the data streams pulse on the other side of the glass. He didn't know that his computer problem was a ripple from a digital tsunami my team was actively fighting. He didn't know that his real trucks on real roads were just data points on my screen, vulnerable pieces in a much larger game. He saw a daughter who had abandoned him. I saw a critical piece of national infrastructure under attack. My finger hovered over the screen. I didn't feel the sting of his words. Not anymore. The disappointment had been a constant companion for so long, it had become background noise. What I felt was a profound, almost serene sense of distance. He was a man shouting from a sinking ship, angry at the ocean, instead of the holes in his hull. I pressed delete, not with anger, but with the finality of closing a file that was no longer relevant. A young lieutenant appeared at the door, his posture perfect. "Ma'am, your transport is ready. You have a personal engagement." I gave a single crisp nod. My personal engagement. My wedding. I was leaving a world built on logic and truth to enter a room with a man who refused to see either. Deleting that voicemail didn't erase the memory it came from. As I walked through the sterile corridors toward the exit, the polished floors reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights, my mind drifted back to a different room. One filled with dark wood, the scent of old leather, and the weight of my father's expectations. A place he called his study, but I always thought of as his altar. I was 15, standing in the doorway holding a book on network theory. It was my Bible at the time, filled with diagrams that looked like constellations, explaining how invisible information could connect the entire world. My father, Richard Vance, sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He wasn't looking at spreadsheets or business reports. He was polishing a small, perfect replica of a Peterbilt truck with a soft cloth the way another man might handle a precious jewel. His office was a shrine to the tangible world he worshipped. Glass cases lined the walls, filled with meticulously detailed models of cargo ships, freight trains, and an entire fleet of his company's 18-wheelers. Each one was a testament to his life's work, to moving physical things from one place to another. To him, this was the only kind of power that mattered, the power of steel and diesel and concrete. He finally looked up, his eyes glancing at the book in my hands before dismissing it entirely. He gestured with the model truck toward the sprawling collection behind the glass. "This is real, Norah," he said, his voice patient as if explaining a simple truth to a child. "This is an empire. Every one of these trucks, every ship, it represents a family being fed, a city being built. You can touch it. You can stand on it." I tried to explain. I told him that the data in my book was what told those trucks where to go, what routes to take, what they were carrying. I said the information was just as real, just as powerful. He set the model down and leaned back in his leather chair, a sad smile on his face. "That's the difference between you and me," he said. "Data isn't a tangible good. It isn't a commodity. It's just electricity. Whispers in a wire. You can't build an empire on whispers, honey. You'll never understand what it takes to build something real." He wasn't trying to be cruel. In his mind, he was offering guidance. He was trying to steer me away from a world of shadows and back into the solid, dependable world he understood. But in that moment, the distance between us felt as vast as an ocean. He saw an empire of things. I was already seeing an empire of information. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me even then that his world was becoming a museum, while mine was becoming the future. I didn't argue. I just nodded, closed my book, and walked away, the silent hum of his miniature, unmoving world at my back. The memory of my father's study faded as the heavy doors of the command center sealed behind me. Back in the present, the world felt sharper, the stakes higher. The week leading up to my wedding wasn't filled with cake tastings or seating chart debates. It was a countdown clock ticking toward a crisis only a handful of people on the planet knew was coming. My team had flagged it 3 weeks prior. A new strain of malware, elegant in its brutality, was slithering through the digital back alleys of global commerce. We codenamed it Lockjaw. Unlike the smash-and-grab ransomware attacks that made headlines, Lockjaw was a parasite. It didn't just lock systems, it learned them. It burrowed deep into a network's core, mapping every connection, every dependency, every vulnerability before it made a single move. It was patient, it was intelligent, and it was targeting the American supply chain. From a secure terminal in my apartment between calls with the wedding caterer, I was tracking its progress. It was moving like a predator, testing the fences of smaller logistics companies, learning their protocols, and then retreating into the shadows. My gut told me this was a precursor to something catastrophic. We were watching a tiger sharpen its claws before going after the biggest prey in the jungle. The day came 4 days before the wedding. An alert flashed on my screen, a deep crimson that cut through the noise of 1,000 other data points. Lockjaw had made its move. It had sunk its teeth into the servers of Vance Logistics, my father's company. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, but it wasn't an emotional one. It was strategic. They weren't just targeting him, they were using his company as a key. Vance Logistics was a critical node, a central hub connected to dozens of ports, railways, and trucking networks across the country. Paralyzing him was the first step to paralyzing the entire eastern seaboard. My fiancé Leo found me standing in the dark of our living room, the only light coming from the cascading lines of code on my monitor. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just stood beside me, a quiet, solid presence in the storm. He put a hand on my shoulder and pointed to a small headline on his phone's news app. "Chaos at Baltimore Port. Shipments delayed indefinitely." "That's your father's main hub, isn't it?" he asked softly. I nodded, my eyes never leaving the screen. "It's not about him, Leo. It's bigger than that. He's just the first domino. Leo understood. He was an architect, a man who saw how foundations supported entire structures. He knew that a crack in one part of the system could bring the whole thing down. He didn't see my work as a game. He saw it as the invisible framework holding the modern world together. "This is it, isn't it?" he said. "The thing you've been preparing for." I zoomed out on the map, the red alert at Vance Logistics, now linked by a dozen faint pulsing lines to other critical hubs. The infection was dormant waiting. The hackers had the key. They just hadn't decided when to turn it. "They're waiting," I said. "They want to cause maximum disruption. They're building their arsenal. And my father is now officially patient zero." He thinks he has a business problem, but he's standing at the epicenter of a national security crisis. And he has no idea. The call came the next morning as expected. The caller ID simply read Richard Vance. I let it ring 3 times before answering, putting it on speaker so Leo could hear. I wanted him to be a witness not just to my father's words, but to my reaction. "Norah." His voice was a low growl, frayed at the edges with a stress he couldn't conceal. There was no preamble, no pretense of asking how I was. "The entire system is down. Everything. The port, the warehouses, our routing software. It's all dark." I remained silent, letting the weight of his admission hang in the air. For him, this was a confession of failure, a crack in the armor of the self-made man. He took a sharp breath, the sound crackling over the line. "They want $10 million, Norah. $10 million. In some untraceable crypto garbage. Can you believe the nerve? They think they can hold a $50 million company hostage?" His tone was one of outrage, but underneath it I could hear the tremor of fear. This wasn't a negotiation he could win by bullying or blustering his way through. This was a world where he had no power, and he knew it. I finally spoke, my voice calm and measured. "What are you going to do?" "What am I going to do?" He shot back, his voice rising. "What am I supposed to do?" "This is your world, isn't it? This digital nonsense. You're supposed to be some kind of expert. I'm calling you for a solution, not questions." The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. For decades, my world had been a fantasy, a game. Now that the game had turned real and come for him, he was demanding I show him the cheat codes. "I can't get involved in a private sector ransom negotiation, Dad. It's against protocol. That's the truth, but not the whole truth." A bitter laugh echoed down the line. "Protocol, of course. Always hiding behind your rules and your uniforms. I built this company with my bare hands, Norah. I provided for you, for your mother. I built something that lasts, something you can touch. And when it's under attack, you talk to me about protocol." His voice dropped, becoming heavy with a familiar weaponized disappointment. "You know, if I'd had a son, a real successor, he'd be here right now fighting this with me. He would have learned the business. He wouldn't be off playing some glorified version of Battleship while his family's legacy burns to the ground." The words were meant to hurt, to shame me into action, to remind me of my ultimate failure in his eyes, not being the son he always wanted. But they didn't land. All I heard was the desperate roar of a dinosaur sinking into the tar. He wasn't just losing his company. He was losing his relevance in a world that had moved on without him. "I'm sorry you're in this position," I said, my voice devoid of the emotion he was trying to provoke. "But I can't help you." The line went silent for a moment, then the call ended abruptly. He had hung up on me. Leo looked at me, his expression unreadable. "He thinks you're abandoning him," he said. I shook my head, turning my gaze back to the city skyline outside our window. "He doesn't see me at all, Leo. He never has. He just sees the son he never had. And that's a ghost I can't fight." The night before my wedding felt impossibly still. The chaos of my father's company, the looming threat of Lockjaw, the silent war I was waging from the shadows, all of it seemed to fade into a low hum. In its place was a quiet, profound sense of purpose. I stood in the guest room of our apartment, the city lights painting soft patterns on the wall. Hanging from the door was my dress uniform. Not the traditional white lace and silk of a bride, but the stark immaculate white of a Navy admiral's full dress uniform. The gold buttons gleamed. The 4 silver stars on each shoulder board seemed to absorb the dim light, holding a universe of responsibility in their sharp points. On my chest, rows of ribbons sat in perfect alignment, a silent, colorful language that told the story of my life. Each one represented a place I had been, a choice. I had made a price I had paid. Leo came and stood in the doorway watching me. He wasn't holding a glass of champagne or wearing a nervous groom's smile. He held a small professional-grade steamer in his hand. He walked over to the uniform, his movements gentle and deliberate. He ran a hand over the sleeve, his touchlight almost reverent. Most people see the uniform and they see the rank, he said, his voice soft. They see the power of the institution. But I see you, Norah. He gestured to a small, simple ribbon tucked among more decorated ones. The Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. What was this one for? Operation Silent Anchor. I answered, my voice barely a whisper. A mission off the coast of Somalia. It was a long time ago. He nodded slowly, his eyes tracing the other ribbons. And this one, the one with the bronze star, that was Afghanistan. We lost 2 people getting our intel team out. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He just listened, his gaze full of a deep, unwavering understanding. He wasn't just looking at decorations. He was seeing the scars they represented. He finally looked from the uniform to me, his eyes meeting mine in the reflection of the window. Each one of these is a chapter, Norah. It's the story of who you are. This isn't just a uniform. It's a map of your life. It's the most honest thing you could possibly wear tomorrow. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. His words were an anchor in the quiet storm of my thoughts. My father saw the uniform as a betrayal, a symbol of the path I had chosen instead of the one he had laid out for me. To him, it was a costume I wore to play a game. But to Leo, it was my skin. It was the truth. He plugged in the steamer, and a soft hiss filled the room. He carefully began to work on the sleeves, his movements precise, like the architect he was ensuring every line was perfect, every crease gone. As he worked, I felt a cold, hard resolve settle deep in my bones. It wasn't anger at my father. It was something clearer. It was acceptance. My father saw my life as a series of wrong turns. But tomorrow, I would walk down the aisle wearing the map of that journey. And for the first time, I wouldn't be walking away from him. I would be walking toward a man who had already taken the time to learn the route. The morning of my wedding arrived with a clear blue sky and a chilling sense of inevitability. While most brides would be dealing with hair and makeup, I was dealing with national security. At Yo 600, just as the sun began to climb over the horizon, I was in the study of our apartment, which I had converted into a temporary secure command post. Before me, a triple encrypted laptop displayed the digital battlefield. The Lockjaw virus was stirring. My team had been working through the night, tracing its tendrils as they spread silently from my father's compromised servers into the larger network. It was just as I'd feared. The hackers weren't just after a $10 million payday from Vance Logistics. That was a distraction, a smokescreen. They were using my father's company as a launch pad for a coordinated, crippling attack on the entire U.S. supply chain. For 30 minutes, I was not Norah Vance the bride. I was Admiral Vance, the commander. My fingers flew across the keyboard, issuing a series of precise coded commands. I authorized Sentinel Protocol, a defensive measure that would create digital firewalls around the nation's most critical infrastructure. I moved assets, rerouted data traffic, and set digital traps, all while the city outside was just beginning to wake up. I was calm, strangely, terrifyingly calm. This was a familiar rhythm to me, the careful balancing of risk and reward, the quiet intensity of making decisions that would affect millions, all while the world remained blissfully unaware. It was the same focus I'd had on the deck of a destroyer in hostile waters, the same clarity I'd felt leading a team into a digital storm. Leo found me there, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He didn't say a word, just placed it on the desk beside me. He knew this was part of the deal. He knew that marrying me meant marrying the responsibilities that were woven into my life, as integral as the ribbons on my uniform. He simply asked, "Are we going to be late?" I looked at the clock. Oh, 6:30. There were still hours before the ceremony. I typed one final command, a kill switch for a backdoor I discovered in the malware. It was a gamble, a move that could either trap the hackers or alert them to our presence. But my instincts told me it was the right play. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark, and the silence of the apartment rushed back in. "No," I said, looking up at him. "We won't be late." I stood up, the Admiral fading away, leaving Norah the bride in her place. The battle was set. The pieces were in position. Now all I had to do was get married. The calm I felt wasn't just professionalism. It was the profound certainty of a commander who knew she was several moves ahead of her enemy. The war for the country's infrastructure had begun. And as I walked away to get ready for my wedding, I knew the most critical engagement was still to come. The chapel was old built from dark wood and stained glass that told stories of naval battles long past. It was supposed to be a small ceremony. Family, a few close friends, Leo's parents, maybe 50 people in total. That was the plan. But as Leo and I arrived stepping out of a simple black sedan, I realized my team had a different definition of family. They were already there, standing in small, quiet groups on the manicured lawn outside the chapel. They weren't on my guest list. I hadn't invited them. In my world, you didn't mix the personal with the professional. It was a line you didn't cross. But they had crossed it for me. There were over 200 of them. Men and women I had served with, led, and in some cases sent into harm's way. They were the elite of U.S. Cyber Command, the digital soldiers, the code breakers, the silent warriors who protected the nation from threats no one ever saw. And today, they weren't in tactical gear. They were in their full dress uniforms, Navy whites, Air Force blues, Army greens, a sea of immaculate service members, their posture perfect, their presence radiating a quiet, formidable strength. My executive officer, Commander Eva Rostova, a brilliant woman who could dismantle a hostile network with the same ease she could quote classic literature, stepped forward. She gave me a small, knowing smile. "Admiral," she said, her voice respectful but firm. "We apologize for the intrusion, but it was non-negotiable. We couldn't let you walk in there alone." I looked past her at the faces in the crowd. I saw Lieutenant Commander Jackson, the young prodigy who'd identified the first traces of the Lockjaw virus. I saw Master Chief Petty Officer Chen, a man whose quiet wisdom had guided me through more than one crisis. I saw faces of people who had sacrificed weekends, holidays, and family dinners to answer a call to duty that came without parades or public recognition. These weren't just my colleagues. This was my other family. The one forged not by blood, but by shared purpose and mutual respect. They understood the weight of the stars on my shoulders in a way no one else could. They knew the sleepless nights, the impossible decisions, the silent burden of command. Their presence wasn't an intrusion. It was a statement. It was a silent, powerful affirmation of the life I had chosen. Leo, who had been standing quietly by my side, put his hand on the small of my back. He leaned in and whispered, "It looks like your fan club showed up." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel all morning. It wasn't pride. It was a profound sense of belonging. I gave Commander Rostova a single grateful nod. "Thank you, Eva. All of you, find a seat. There's plenty of room." She smiled. "We already have our assignments, ma'am." As they began to file into the chapel, their movements synchronized and efficient. I knew this was no longer just my wedding. It had become something more. It was a muster, a gathering of the clan, and their unified presence created an invisible shield around me, a silent force that I knew I would need for the battle that was about to unfold inside those chapel doors. The heavy doors swung open, and I stepped into the light. The organ music swelled, a majestic, soaring sound that filled the high-ceiling space. As I began my walk down the aisle, the room fell into a profound, respectful silence. I saw Leo waiting for me at the altar, his face a perfect picture of calm, unwavering love. His presence was a lighthouse in the turbulent waters of the last few hours. For that short walk, I allowed myself to be just Norah. Not the Admiral, not the daughter of a broken man, just a woman walking toward her future. The faces of my team turned toward me, their expressions a mixture of respect and a quiet brotherly affection. They were my witnesses. They were my family. But as I reached the front and took my place beside Leo, I allowed my gaze to sweep over the civilian section. And that's when I saw it. The second, quieter battle taking place in the pews. My father was not sitting alone. He was surrounded by his peers, men I recognized from company picnics and holiday parties years ago. Robert Sterling, the head of a major shipping conglomerate. Marcus Thorne, a venture capitalist with deep ties to the transport industry. They were the titans of my father's world, the men whose respect he valued above all else. And they were not looking at the ceremony. They were whispering, leaning close to one another, their heads bowed. From across the aisle, I couldn't hear their words, but I could read their body language perfectly. It was a language I had seen in boardrooms and crisis meetings my entire life. It was the language of circling sharks. The news of the Lockjaw Attack of Vance Logistics being frozen solid had clearly spread beyond the company walls. It was a rumor, a piece of industry gossip, that was now being confirmed by the strained, haunted look on my father's face. I watched as Robert Sterling leaned over and murmured something to my father. My father's jaw tightened, and he gave a curt, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He was being cornered, questioned, and judged in the one place he should have felt safe. His business empire was under siege, and now his social standing was eroding right here in the middle of his own daughter's wedding. The pressure was clearly getting to him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze darting from his whispering colleagues to the sea of calm, disciplined service members on my side of the aisle. He was caught between two worlds he didn't understand. The digital world that had brought his company to its knees and the military world that had claimed his daughter. And in this moment, both seemed to have allied against him. The chaplain began to speak, his voice warm and steady, but I barely heard him. I was watching the slow motion collapse of my father's universe. The whispers continued, a persistent, corrosive undercurrent to the sacred vows being spoken. I saw Marcus Thorne discreetly check his phone, his eyebrows raising in alarm. The financial bleeding was likely becoming a hemorrhage. The $10 million ransom was a secret he couldn't keep, and in his world, a sign of weakness was an invitation for predators to attack. He was losing control. And for a man like Richard Vance, a man who had built his entire identity on being in command, losing control was a fate worse than death. The pressure in that chapel was building not just for me, but for him. And I knew with a cold certainty that it was only a matter of time before it found a release. We made it through the vows. Leo's voice was steady and clear, a promise of partnership and respect that felt like the only solid ground in the room. My own voice was just as firm, each word a conscious choice, a commitment not just to him, but to the future we were building, a future defined by our own terms. When the chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, a wave of heartfelt, genuine applause rose from my side of the aisle. From my father's side, it was more scattered, more polite. The whispers had done their damage. The reception was held in an adjoining hall, a beautiful room with high windows overlooking the water. But the tension had followed us from the chapel. My father's business associates kept their distance from him, talking in tight, anxious huddles. He stood alone for a long time, a drink in his hand, looking less like the father of the bride, and more like a deposed king surveying his lost territory. Then came the toasts. Leo's father went first, telling a warm, funny story about Leo's childhood. Then Eva, my executive officer, gave a toast that was both respectful and deeply personal, speaking of leadership and trust in a way that everyone in uniform understood perfectly. Finally, it was my father's turn. He walked to the microphone, his movements stiff. The room fell quiet, but it was a heavy, expectant silence. He gripped the stand, his knuckles white. I had hoped for a fleeting moment that he might choose grace, that he might see the room filled with accomplished, dedicated people who respected his daughter and feel a flicker of pride. I was wrong. He didn't look at me or Leo. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of his colleagues, the men who were now judging him. His speech wasn't for us. It was for them. It was a desperate public attempt to reclaim his narrative. He started by talking about what it means to build something real. He spoke of steel, of concrete, of the sweat and grit it takes to create a tangible empire, his voice dripping with self-importance. He was reminding them and himself of who he used to be. Then he turned his attention to me. "My daughter Norah," he said. His voice, laced with a bitter irony, chose a different path. While some of us were building the foundations of this country's economy, she was playing on computers. The words hung in the air, a deliberate public insult. He wasn't done. He raised his glass, a mocking gesture. "So let's toast to the next generation. May they one day understand that you can't solve real-world problems by hiding behind a screen." He looked directly at me. "And may they learn that while some of us are out here fighting to save a real empire, others are content to just play games." A wave of stunned silence rolled through the room. My team sat rigid, their faces masks of cold fury. Leo's hand found mine under the table, his grip firm and steadying. My father had just taken his private disappointment and made it a public spectacle. He hadn't just insulted me. He had belittled my entire world, my entire life's work in front of everyone who mattered to me. He had thrown down the gauntlet, completely unaware that he was standing on a battlefield he had already lost. In the deafening silence that followed my father's toast, a strange thing happened. I felt no anger, no surge of shame or hurt. The daggers he had thrown so publicly didn't even scratch the surface. All I felt was a profound, almost chilling sense of clarity. I looked at him standing there by the microphone, his face flushed with a desperate, defiant pride. He thought he had delivered a knockout blow, a final public judgment on my life's choices. He thought he was the powerful patriarch putting his wayward daughter in her place. But I didn't see a powerful man, I saw a scared one. I saw a man whose world was shrinking, whose certainties were turning to sand, and who was lashing out at the one person who represented the future he couldn't comprehend. His words weren't about me. They were a eulogy for his own relevance. I held Leo's hand, my thumb gently stroking his knuckles. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to say a word. In the world of strategy that I inhabited, the most powerful move is often the one you don't make. You let your opponent overextend you, let them expose their weaknesses, and you wait for the precise moment when the board state changes in your favor. And I knew with the same certainty that I knew the sun would rise tomorrow, that the board state was about to change. I had set the pieces in motion at 0600 that morning. The kill switch, I had activated the Sentinel protocol I had authorized. They weren't just defensive measures. They were a net slowly closing around the hackers. My team wasn't just sitting here in their dress uniforms listening to insults. They were monitoring the situation on encrypted devices. They were waiting for my signal. I looked across the room at Commander Rostova. She met my gaze from across the crowded hall, and I gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was a look we had shared across continents, across secure video links in the middle of crises that the world would never know about. It was a look of confirmation, a look that said, "Stand by." My father was still basking in the uncomfortable silence, mistaking it for acquiescence. He raised his glass one final time, a king on a cardboard throne. He had no idea that his so-called real world of trucks and warehouses was now a digital dependency. He had no idea that the game he so despised was the only thing keeping the national supply chain from collapsing entirely. He had just publicly shamed me for not living in his world. And in a few moments, he was about to find out that he was in fact living in mine. The reckoning was coming, not because I had willed it, but because he had summoned it. All I had to do was wait. My father was still standing by the microphone, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. He was about to sit down, believing he'd had the final word. He had miscalculated. The final word wasn't his to have. Just as he turned to leave the stage, a side door to the hall opened with a quiet urgency. A young man in a crisp Navy service dress uniform entered the room. He wasn't on the guest list. He was my aide, Lieutenant Miller. He moved with a swift, focused purpose, his eyes scanning the room for only one person. Me. He ignored the stage. He ignored my father. He walked directly to our table, his path cutting a straight, unwavering line through the stunned silence of the guests. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing that the carefully constructed reality of the afternoon was about to shatter. Miller stopped beside me, leaned down and spoke in a low, formal tone, but his voice carried with the clarity of a command in the sudden quiet. "Admiral Vance," he said, "the White House is on a secure line. Containment of the Lockjaw threat is entering its final phase. We have confirmation that the primary breach originated from the servers at Vance Logistics." The name of the company, my father's company, dropped into the silence like a stone into a perfectly still pond. I saw my father freeze halfway to his seat. His colleagues, the whispering men in the pews, all stopped and stared. Miller continued, his voice unwavering. "Under the authority of the National Security Act, a Level 5 containment order has just been issued for all Vance Logistics digital and physical assets. Sir, they need your verbal authorization to execute the Vance protocol." My father's face, which had been flushed with defiant pride just moments before, was now a ghastly pale white. He looked from the young lieutenant to me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. He was connecting the dots: the computer problem, the $10 million ransom, and the sudden, overwhelming military presence in the room. He didn't understand the specifics. He didn't need to. He understood only one thing. The game he had mocked, the digital nonsense he had ridiculed, was not only real, but it now held the fate of his entire empire in its hands. And the person in command of it all was the daughter he had just publicly humiliated. The room was utterly silent. 200 service members sat perfectly still, their eyes forward. But every one of them was acutely aware of the power shift that had just occurred. A shift so seismic, it felt like the laws of gravity had suddenly been rewritten. My father's world had just collided with mine, and his had been annihilated. All eyes in the room were on me. The silence was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. My father stood frozen by the stage, a statue carved from shock. His business partners stared, their mouths slightly agape. They were financiers, titans of industry men who understood power in terms of dollars and assets. And they were witnessing a currency of power they had never encountered before, one that made their fortunes seem utterly irrelevant. I looked at Lieutenant Miller. Then slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back and stood up. My movements were calm, unhurried. As I rose to my full height in my white dress uniform, a sound cut through the silence. It wasn't a voice. It was the sharp, unified scrape of 200 chairs moving in perfect sync against the polished wooden floor. Then came the voice. It was Commander Rostova. Her voice wasn't a shout, but it had the carrying power of a command on the deck of a ship. It was crisp, authoritative, and utterly unequivocal. "Admiral on deck." The effect was instantaneous. Every single service member in that room, from the youngest lieutenant to the most decorated senior officer, rose to their feet as one. They didn't just stand. They snapped to attention, their posture ramrod straight, their faces forward, their presence transforming the wedding reception into a formal military assembly. It wasn't a gesture of politeness. It wasn't for show. It was a reflex, an ingrained, instinctual display of respect for the chain of command. It was the formal recognition of authority. My authority. The air crackled with a sudden, immense pressure. The civilian guests, including my father, were suddenly the outsider spectators in a ritual they didn't understand, but whose power they could feel in their bones. I looked at my father. His face had gone from pale to ashen. The smug certainty of a few moments ago had been completely erased, replaced by a raw, naked bewilderment. He was looking at me, but he wasn't seeing his daughter. He was seeing the 4 stars on my shoulders reflected in the eyes of 200 of the nation's finest. He was seeing a power he had not only failed to recognize, but had actively mocked. Then came the sound that sealed his humiliation. It was small, but in the profound silence, it was as loud as a cannon shot. The champagne glass he was still holding, the one he had used to toast my failure, slipped from his nerveless fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound broke the spell, but the image was permanent. His world, his arrogance, his judgment, all lay in pieces at his feet. I let the shattered silence hang in the air for a beat longer, allowing the full weight of the moment to settle. My father remained frozen, staring at the glittering shards of glass on the floor, as if they were the ruins of his entire life. The authority he had spent a lifetime building had evaporated in less than a minute. I turned my full attention back to Lieutenant Miller. He stood patiently at attention, his gaze fixed on a point just over my shoulder, awaiting his orders. The chaos, the family drama, the public humiliation, none of it existed for him. There was only the mission. My voice when I spoke was not loud, but it cut through the room with absolute clarity. It was the voice I used on the command deck, the voice of calm, unwavering authority in the heart of a storm. "Lieutenant," I said, "you can inform the White House that the Vance Protocol is authorized for immediate execution. Full operational control is delegated to Commander Rostova for the duration of the containment. Relay all critical updates to me through secure channels only." "Understood, understood, Admiral," he replied without hesitation. He gave a sharp, precise nod, turned on his heel, and walked out of the room as quickly and quietly as he had entered. The mission was now in motion. The digital cavalry was on its way. Only then did I allow my gaze to drift back to the room. My team remained standing, a silent, powerful wall of support. I gave them a small, almost imperceptible nod of dismissal. As one, they relaxed from the position of attention and sat down, the rustle of their uniforms the only sound in the room. The formal assembly was over. The power had been demonstrated. Finally, I looked at Leo. He hadn't moved. He hadn't flinched. He was simply watching me, his eyes filled not with shock, but with a deep, profound pride. He had seen the Admiral. He had seen the Commander. And he had seen the woman he had just married. And he loved all of them. He reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. A silent question passed between us. "Are you okay?" I gave his hand a gentle squeeze. A silent answer. "More than okay." Then I did the one thing no one in the room expected. I picked up my own champagne glass from the table, my hand perfectly steady. I turned to my husband, raised the glass, and smiled a genuine, radiant smile for the first time that day. "To us," I said, my voice now soft, meant only for him. "To building our own empire." He smiled back, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "To us," he echoed. We clinked our glasses together, the clear, bright sound a stark contrast to the shattering glass that had preceded it. The power shift was complete. The battle was over. The rest of the world, with its noise and its drama and its broken kings, simply faded away. In that moment, there was only the two of us and the quiet, unshakable foundation of the life we were about to build. The rest of the reception unfolded in a strange, surreal haze. The moment of reckoning had passed, but its aftershocks still rippled through the room. My simple command and quiet toast with Leo had acted as a release valve, giving everyone permission to breathe again. Music began to play softly, and servers started moving through the tables once more. But the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. My father had retreated to his table, where he sat in a state of stunned silence. His colleagues, the titans of industry, who had been whispering about his downfall, now actively avoided his gaze. They didn't mock him. They didn't confront him. They simply isolated him. In their world, power was the only currency, and he had just been publicly declared bankrupt. He was no longer a peer. He was a cautionary tale. No one approached our table for a long time. It was as if we were surrounded by an invisible force field. My team, my 200 guests, formed a protective perimeter. They mingled, they talked, they drank, but they were always aware, always creating a buffer. They gave Leo and me a small island of peace in the middle of the storm's wreckage. Eventually, a few brave souls from Leo's side of the family came over to offer their congratulations, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and slight intimidation. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones, as if they were afraid a sudden move might trigger another national security directive. About an hour later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the water, I saw my father get up from his table. He walked not toward me, but toward the exit. His shoulders were slumped, his confident, commanding stride gone, replaced by the slow, heavy shuffle of a defeated man. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. He paused at the door and looked back. His eyes found mine across the crowded room. There was no anger left in them, no resentment, just a hollow, bewildered emptiness. It was the look of a man who had not only lost a battle, but had just realized he had been fighting on the wrong side of the war his entire life. He seemed to want to say something, to make some gesture, but no words came. He simply held my gaze for a long moment, a silent, unreadable acknowledgement of his complete and utter defeat. Then he turned and walked out, disappearing into the twilight. I didn't feel a surge of victory. I didn't feel the sweet satisfaction of revenge. I just felt a quiet, somber sense of an ending. A long, painful chapter of my life had finally irrevocably closed. I wasn't his failed daughter anymore, and he was no longer the towering giant of my childhood. We were just two strangers separated by a lifetime of misunderstanding, who had nothing left to say to each other. Our honeymoon was a quiet week in a small coastal town, a world away from command centers and family drama. For the first time in years, my phone was off. There were no encrypted alerts, no secure video calls. There was only the sound of the waves, the scent of salt in the air, and the steady, calming presence of Leo beside me. We returned to a city that felt different. The air seemed lighter. The weight that I had carried on my shoulders for so long, the constant low-grade hum of my father's disapproval was gone. I hadn't realized how heavy it was until it was lifted. A week after we got back, a package arrived at our apartment. It was a simple manila envelope with no return address, addressed to me in a shaky, unfamiliar script. Inside, there was no long, soul-bearing letter. There was no grand apology. There was just a single sheet of paper, a financial statement from a newly created trust fund, and a short handwritten note on a separate piece of cardstock. The note had only a few sentences. It was from my father. It read, "I spent my life building an empire of things that could be broken. You spent yours building something that protects them. I don't understand your world, Norah, but I am beginning to respect it. I sold what was left of the company. A significant portion of the proceeds has been put into this trust." The note was signed simply Richard. I looked at the financial statement. The amount in the trust was substantial, millions of dollars. But it wasn't the money that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the name of the trust. He had named it the Norah Vance Legacy Fund. Its stated purpose was to provide scholarships for young women pursuing degrees in cybersecurity and digital engineering. Leo came and stood behind me, reading the documents over my shoulder. He put his hands on my shoulders, his grip gentle. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say, "He finally came around." He just said, "What are you going to do?" I thought about it for a long moment. My first instinct was to reject it, to send it back, to prove that I didn't need his money, that my success was my own. But then I looked at the name of the fund again, the Norah Vance Legacy Fund. He hadn't tried to buy my forgiveness. He hadn't asked for a relationship. He had, in the only way he knew how, finally acknowledged me. He had taken the ruins of his tangible empire and used them to invest in my intangible one. It wasn't an apology. It was a concession. It was the ultimate admission that my world, the world of whispers in a wire, was the one that truly had the power to last. "I won't touch the money," I said to Leo. "But I will manage the fund. I'll make sure it goes to the right people." It was the perfect resolution. I didn't have to forgive him. I didn't even have to see him. But I could take his final act of surrender and transform it into a legacy. A legacy that would empower a new generation of women to build worlds he could never have imagined. His empire was dead. Mine was just beginning. Life found a new, quieter rhythm. The Norah Vance Legacy Fund became a quiet passion project, a way to build something constructive from the ashes of the past. But my primary mission, my true work, continued. The Vance Protocol, the defensive strategy that had been born in the crucible of my family's crisis, was now the gold standard for protecting national infrastructure. It had saved my father's company, but its real success was in how it had since prevented dozens of other larger attacks on the nation's supply chain. About 6 months after the wedding, I was invited to a multi-agency security conference in Washington, D.C. It wasn't a public event. It was a high-level briefing for cabinet members, agency directors, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The topic was the future of cyber warfare, and I was the keynote speaker. As I prepared my notes in a small office beforehand, there was a quiet knock on the door. I expected it to be an aide, but when I opened it, my father was standing there. He wasn't the titan of industry from my childhood, nor the broken man from my wedding. He was just a man. Older, thinner, dressed in a simple suit. He looked hesitant, uncertain. It was the first time we had seen each other since that day. He cleared his throat, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "Norah, I heard you were speaking today. I was hoping I could listen." I was surprised. He hadn't asked for this. He had been invited by an old contact at the Department of Commerce, someone who didn't know our history. He had come here on his own. I simply nodded. The public gallery is open. He gave a small, grateful nod and disappeared down the hall. Later, as I stood at the podium, I could see him in the back row of the gallery. He sat alone, a solitary figure, in a sea of uniforms and official-looking civilians. I began my speech. I talked about the evolving nature of conflict. I spoke of digital battlefields and the courage of the silent soldiers who defended them. I explained the core tenets of the Vance Protocol, not as a technical manual but as a philosophy. It was about proactivity over reactivity. It was about seeing the entire system, not just the individual parts. It was about building defenses that were as intelligent and adaptable as the threats they were designed to stop. As I spoke, I laid out the story of the Lockjaw virus. I didn't use his name. I didn't mention his company. I simply referred to it as Case Study Alpha, the initial breach that had threatened to cascade into a national disaster. I spoke of the company's vulnerabilities, its outdated systems, its refusal to adapt to a changing world. It was a clinical, dispassionate analysis of failure. Then I shifted. I spoke of how that failure became a catalyst for success, how the lessons learned from that one breach had led to the creation of a system that now protected thousands of businesses, large and small. I finished my speech, and the room, filled with some of the most powerful people in the country, rose to its feet in a sustained, respectful applause. As the applause continued, I looked to the back of the room. My father was standing too. He wasn't applauding. He was just standing there watching me. And for the first time in my entire life, I saw it. Unmistakable, unvarnished. It was pride. It was the look of a man who finally truly understood. He hadn't just heard a speech. He had listened to his daughter, and in her voice, he had finally recognized the language of a builder. After the applause died down and the crowd began to disperse, I made my way through the handshakes and the quiet congratulations. As I headed for the exit, I saw my father waiting for me in the marbled corridor, standing near a window that overlooked the Washington Monument. He watched me approach, his posture no longer uncertain. When I stopped in front of him, he didn't offer a handshake or a hug. He simply looked me in the eye, his gaze clear and direct. I never understood, he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I was so focused on the empire, I could see I never realized you were building an invisible one that was infinitely stronger." I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. The name of my protocol. He continued, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "The Vance Protocol. You kept the family name on it. Even after everything. It wasn't about you." I said, my voice softer than I intended. It was about the lesson. Good engineering is a legacy. It should be built to last. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small laminated card. It was an ID badge for a guest lecturer at a local university. They asked me to speak to some business students, he said, showing it to me. They want me to talk about my experience, about the importance of adapting to new technology, about what happens when you don't. He looked away out the window. I'm calling the lecture Lessons from Case Study Alpha. I felt a slight surprising shift inside me. He wasn't just accepting his failure, he was owning it. He was turning his biggest humiliation into his most important lesson. He was finally in his own way learning to speak my language. I'm proud of you, I said, and the words when they came felt true. He finally met my gaze again, and for the first time the vast empty space between us seemed to shrink. He gave me a single respectful nod, a nod between equals. And then he turned and walked away, not like the defeated king from my wedding, but like a man who had found a new, quieter purpose. As I watched him go, I realized what true vindication felt like. It wasn't about the public recognition, the shattered champagne glass, or the reversal of power. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about this quiet moment of mutual understanding. It was about taking the ruins of the past and building something new. Not just a legacy fund, but a bridge, a fragile, tentative bridge, but a bridge nonetheless. My empire wasn't built on code or servers. It was built on the quiet, unshakable belief that the most powerful systems aren't designed to win wars. They're designed to build a better, safer future. And that was a legacy worth fighting for. This story is about the kind of strength that doesn't always make noise. It's about the silent victories that come from staying true to your own expertise, even when the people closest to you refuse to see its value. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Have you ever had to fight to have your skills or your passion recognized? When did you finally prove to yourself that you were on the right path? No matter what anyone else said, share your story in the comments below. Your journey could be the validation someone else needs to hear today. And if you believe in the power of quiet strength and the sweet satisfaction of vindication, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because true power isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the one who builds the future.